From the Center for Defense Information, senior American military officers retired from active duty, determined to find alternatives to war. America's Defense Monitor. A weekly program on war and peace. How it affects you and people throughout the world. Now, here is your host.
Hello. Welcome again to America's Defense Monitor. I'm Rear Admiral Eugene Carroll, U.S. Navy retired Deputy Director of the Center for Defense Information here in Washington, D.C. In this program, you're going to hear some very interesting and at times differing views about how well America's media does in covering the critical issues of our national defense programs.
Reporters have accompanied soldiers into combat for many years. The job of the war correspondent was often dangerous. Many lost their lives, over 80 in Vietnam alone. But the job was also straightforward. Describe the scene at the front, get more information from military headquarters, then find a way to transmit the story back home. Today, reporters assigned to military affairs rarely cover hot wars. They cover complex struggles over policy and power. The outcome of these struggles has a big impact on our lives. In short, the media now covers the various fronts of a lingering Cold War. Today's Cold War correspondents deal in complexities. They have a hard job, and as members of the media, they exist in a state of tension with the military. The military values discipline, loyalty, and control. The media as a group are individualistic, competitive, and hard-pressed by deadlines. In this program, we talk with journalists who cover military affairs and a Pentagon public affairs officer. We interview the dean of a school of communication. We discuss how the reporters do their job and how military and government officials deal with the media. Then we try to judge how effectively the media covers military affairs. Michael Gordon of the New York Times covers the arms control beat. He's in touch with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, the Pentagon, and the White House. Gordon came to the Times from the National Journal.
There's no magic way to do this job, as far as I can tell. There's a lot of work. I think of the stories that I did that worked out the best, that I thought were important. Very rarely does somebody come to you and give you something. There's really a common misconception that all these stories are leaked. So there's no real easy way to do it. It's just a lot of work, a lot of phone calls, a lot of calling people in and out of the office, and also trying to build up some expertise on an issue and develop some long-term contacts so that when you deal with an official who the first 4 times you talk to him was very uptight and reluctant to share information, the 5th time he's looser and he trusts you and he sees that you're not going to identify him in any way, and he trusts your judgment. He sees you're not going to mislead the reader or sensationalize the story, and therefore he's more open with you.
Melissa Healy of the Los Angeles Times formerly worked at U.S. News and World Report and Defense Week.
I tend to take my cues less from the actual agenda of the Pentagon as it comes through the Public Affairs Office than I do generate a lot of story ideas on my own. Of course, you never generate story ideas entirely on your own.
Healy provides some specific examples of working the system.
The more you know about the people and the institutions of the Pentagon, the better you can work that system. I think, for instance, of the often discussed phenomenon of inter-service rivalry at the Pentagon. It's a one large building, one large department that houses 3 separate services, effectively 4 separate services: the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. And they fight, in a sense, over their share of the pie. And they also fight over their roles and their missions in any future war. And there are very different opinions on how to perform, for instance, a mission. Those are the kinds of institutional interests you really have to use to get people to make the argument that best suits their institutional interests. And when you get those arguments from each side and then compare them, you start to put together the picture, the much larger picture.
Neil Rowland is an investigative reporter for United Press International. He's always looking for fresh angles.
What is the part of this puzzle that nobody else, that the beat reporters who cover the breaking developments don't necessarily see? And having the luxury of additional time and resources, I'm able to explore those deeper issues. At the same time, there are leaks. I have a network of sources who I try to keep in touch with from time to time, and who have a certain amount of trust for me, and should they come upon something that they believe needs to be spotlighted, will call me. And every time you do a story, it may have an impact, and some other people may come out from the woodwork who see that, having seen this story and the interest, may say, well, I know of something similar to that, or even worse than that. Public should know about that.
David Martin of CBS TV spends much of the days walking miles of Pentagon corridors. How do you do your job here at the Pentagon?
Basically by wearing out a lot of shoe leather. You really do walk around this building day after day after day. I don't know how many miles, literally miles, I've put in each day walking around these corridors. And it does a couple of things for you. One, there's no substitute for talking to a person face to face. Two, you just, after a while, you just sort of get to have a feel for this building, and you just know when something's going on. I mean, people's faces are tense, people look harried. There's just no substitute for being there and walking the beat and just getting into the building as much as you can. I think it's one of the things that surprises people most about the Pentagon is the degree to which you can walk around this building.
John Barry of Newsweek has less deadline pressure than those reporters who worked for daily newspapers and television.
My beat is much wider than the Pentagon. I suppose I only spend a third to a quarter of my time at the Pentagon. The rest of the time I spend going around the other agencies in this town that have to do with national security, trying to assess the overall picture of the flow of national security policy making.
Dean Sanford Unger of the American University School of Communication says there are two different directions reporters can take on the military beat.
The reporters who develop expertise in this area go one way or the other. They either develop a critical expertise or they develop a compromised expertise. And I think there are examples of each.
What are these two directions?
Well, I think the two directions are this, that there are some people who cover the military for a long time who become sort of militarized. I think that's almost inevitable that it would happen. That some people who spend a lot of, I mean, you know, we all become a lot like the people we spend a lot of time around. You know, you've heard the old thing about the scholars of the Soviet Union start to talk like Soviet bureaucrats sometimes, and often reporters start to resemble the people they cover in many ways. I think there are people who cover military affairs who take on a military attitude, and you know who some of them were, and who came to regard themselves less as correspondents covering the military than as explainers of the military point of view to the general public, not to mention their own editors. I think that's a problem. I mean, that's very...
Unger says David Martin of CBS is a reporter who knows the issues and doesn't suspend his judgment.
I mean, I think there ought to be a sort of like you have a 10-year term for the head of the FBI. Maybe you ought to have a 10-year limit on the time that a person should cover any one beat. It's a trade-off between getting to know your subject so that you really can bring something to the story, and this business of becoming a captive of it. I suppose you start to lose some of your fire and some of your willingness to be tough and take tough shots at the military the longer you're around them. if you walk around feeling like you're a patsy, then obviously it's time for you to go.
According to Melissa Healy, the best way to avoid being taken over is to diversify your sources.
And it's an old principle of the military too. You diversify your sources. You create what the military likes to call redundancy in your sources, so that you have many sources to tap. Not only does it mean that you get a far greater range of views on a particular subject, it also means that if one day you offend someone by having given one view greater credence perhaps than another, you can give that source a rest, and you won't be cut off. I mean, this is, as I say, it's a principle the military likes to use. They're eyes in the sky. They're satellites. They don't like to ever be without eyes or ears, so they put many up there.
We asked Dean Unger to list the obstacles facing military affairs reporters.
Obviously, as with any reporter in any beat, they encounter the obstacle of the Pentagon bureaucracy, which doesn't want to hear bad things, which wants to have its point of view pretty much uncritically accepted. And I think they, like any other reporters, have to worry about burning their sources, losing their sources if they're too independent. I think that they run across the obstacle in many cases of editors who are a little bit overwhelmed themselves by the information coming out of the Pentagon. It's pretty hard to go up against a generally well-intentioned but very heavily focused military promotional effort on behalf of its own budget and its own operations.
Classified information makes a tough job even tougher. Again, Michael Gordon.
Mm-hmm. It's a question I get asked a lot by government officials. They say, who are you to decide that a government secret should be made known? What gives you the credentials or the qualifications to make that sort of decision? And it's a difficult question to answer. But basically, I've thought it through pretty much this way. There's too much classification in the American government. It's a very routine procedure. Almost everything is classified or for official use only, even if it doesn't involve sensitive government secrets. I think one of my more important stories was about the CIA revised its estimate of the size of Soviet underground nuclear blasts. And for years, the Reagan administration has been charging, and actually still charges officially, that the Russians have likely violated the threshold test ban treaties. And it turned out that a bunch of government experts had taken another look at this situation and concluded that the estimating procedures for these blasts were flawed, and had been overestimating the size of their explosions. And this raised the issue about whether the Reagan administration's allegations were false. And so I went and wrote an article saying the estimate had been changed. I named the body who did this. This, by the way, came as news to a lot of the so-called nuclear experts in the State Department. Well, they were genuine experts, but they didn't know this had happened. So I thought it was very important to make known the fact that government experts were implicitly challenging this, the merits of this accusation. Even though, and I didn't reveal anything about our detection capabilities or anything that might compromise our sort of methods of deriving this intelligence from the Soviet Union. But I still thought it was an important fact to be made known.
Gordon chose to reveal the information because of the public's right to know about an important internal struggle over policy. He carefully did not release secret technical information. We came to the Pentagon to interview Colonel David Shea, Director of Defense Information.
But I would say, who is empowered to classify or not classify? Surely not the press, which is not empowered to do this. The press isn't necessarily interested, or should I say primarily interested, in national security. They're interested in a good story. It's the responsibility of the President, the Secretary of Defense, and those empowered to protect the secrets of this country who make that judgment. And that's the way I think the American people would like to see it.
However, the working press tends to see the bureaucracy, including the Pentagon, as excessively secretive.
While they need us and want to use us and don't want to be an enemy of the press, there are a whole bunch of things that they don't want you to know, like divisions within the ranks on policies, because that connotes disarray, sensitive communications with other governments, perhaps some intelligence information.
Defense is an area, obviously, in which potentially lives are at stake. And it is an area where leaks can have potentially, can harm people's lives. I think any reporter that works in the area recognizes that. And every reporter works with that a little bit. It's also, though, an area in which the habit of keeping information closed is a deeply ingrained one. You can call up people and ask them where the sun rises, and they'll feel they need to check with their superiors before giving you the answer.
It is difficult to get information from the Pentagon. First of all, it's a vast bureaucracy. There are many agencies involved in any given issue, so that what may appear like a simple question, if it comes to us to answer, we may find that there are 3 or 4 different agencies within the Department of Defense that really should coordinate on that answer. And that's my responsibility, to provide official, credible, accurate information. I would also like to add timely, and that is a goal. But sometimes when I must coordinate an answer in 3 and 4 different agencies, it takes time, and I'm not always happy with the timeliness of a response, but we try to work that hard.
As a result of the Vietnam experience, many military officers see the media as an adversary. These officers believe the Vietnam War was lost on America's television screens. They think the media stirred up public opposition to the war. The invasion of Grenada increased the strains between the media and the government. The Reagan administration purposely withheld news of the invasion from its own press spokesman. More infuriating to the news organizations, the administration kept the reporters away from Grenada until the operation was all over. The films you're seeing now were taken by the Defense Department.
The military views the press with total suspicion, 90% of which is based on ignorance. But by the same token, the press views the military with total suspicion, 90% of which is based on ignorance. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a military base and it's like you dropped in from Mars, and they have a preconceived notion of who you are and what you're about. CBS, if you go to an Army base, invariably the first thing they'll say is, CBS, yeah, you're the guys that did that thing to Westmoreland. It's this lack of contact that is the major problem in the relationships between the military and the media, and it's getting worse, not better. I mean, you'd say that because many of the officers who served in Vietnam, who believe that the press lost the war for them, are now in their dotage and no longer on active duty, that the problem would get better. But if you go to the war colleges, to these seminars, these endless military media seminars that all the war colleges put on, I mean, the guys that really are suspicious and hostile toward the media are the captains and the lieutenant colonels, because they've had zero contact with the media. All they know are the war stories they've heard, but they've had zero dealings, and so they believe the absolute worst.
The problems often cited to me that military people have with the press are lack of accuracy and a lack of balance in news stories. The National War College once did a survey of its officers, the students attending classes, and they were asked to list what bothers them most about the press. And they listed arrogance, slanted news, the tendency to go with bad news, and inaccuracy. Those were the four major things that were bothering this particular group of officers. So Vietnam, yes, it's still there to a lesser extent, but I think the military people generally react to the fact that the only thing they tend to see in the press is negative things about the military.
Deception has been almost a stock in trade with this administration. It's not just Ollie North who's been lying as a matter
Neil
of
Rowland's beat includes military and foreign affairs. Rowland earlier spent 4 years as an investigative reporter for Army Times.
In this example, I had obtained a tip from a congressional source that the administration was taking some action vis-a-vis another government, which I will not name for reasons you'll soon find out. A government that was viewed as undemocratic, and that the administration had obtained information about who in this government was leading many of these anti-democratic actions, and what policy options the administration was considering. So I went to a senior State Department official with this congressional tip, and I asked him, is this information true? And I had an itemized list. Is this true? He said, absolutely not. Is this true? Categorically false. Is this true? Certainly not. Without a doubt not. And then I paused in the middle of this conversation after we went through this, and he denied all this on the record and said, would you mind if we went on background here? Now, on background means it's a ground rule in which the source understands, and certainly this source understood, that I would only identify him as a State Department official, not by name. And I then re-asked him the question, and with the protection of this assurance, he then said, well, yes, this is true, and yes, this is true, and yes is true, and not only is that true, but moreover, we learned this. I then went to his subordinate, and this person is directly in charge of policies, of administration, State Department policy on this country. And armed with the information that his superior had provided me, I then asked him, is this true? False. Is this true? Absolutely not. Is this true? Categorically no. And I said, well, okay, thank you. Let's stop here. Can we go on background? And he said, yes. And he said, okay. Again, relying on what his boss had told me, is this true? He said, false. Is this true? No. Is this true? Wrong. So that what you had was a senior State Department official and his subordinate in talking about the same information and the same thing, providing diametrically opposed versions. And you can come to your own conclusions about whether there was any deception there.
How well can the media provide an accurate picture of military affairs in this period of neither war nor peace?
Reporters, I think, do the best job they can under a number of severe constraints.
They do a very adequate job on covering the headlines of the day. I think where they fall down, if I may use that term, is in-depth coverage of the big issues. This is particularly true in the case of television, where serious, in-depth treatment might be considered an hour, less commercials. Now, this is unfortunate because most Americans are informed, or television plays the dominant role in informing Americans. So from that respect, that standpoint, I think that they could do a better job.
British-born John Barry of Newsweek has covered military affairs on both sides of the Atlantic. He thinks a European approach with more analysis would help bring clarity to complex issues.
But it seems to me that there is an enormous concentration on getting the latest minute fact and defining ever more precisely the shape of the trees rather than trying to see what the shape of the forest is. But I suspect that's part and parcel of the nature of American journalism, with its immense concentration on fact and the feeling that it's the business of columnists to try to give some overall picture. And I think quite often that the columnists don't know enough to write sensibly about national security because they're simply not well informed enough, and the reporters who do know really quite a lot aren't encouraged to broaden their perspective. So I sometimes feel that there is a whole area of informed opinion writing that isn't being done in the media in Washington. And that, I think, you can occasionally see damages the public perception of national security.
Melissa Healy of the Los Angeles Times thinks the press does pretty well, but says the readers, listeners, and viewers also have to make an effort.
I think that the various news media do a pretty good job of giving an overall picture of what goes on at the Pentagon, what goes on in the military, what goes on in defense. And I would not say that if I read only one newspaper or only got all my information from television news. I mean, I think in this case consumers have a responsibility too. If you have an interest in defense, I frankly don't really think that as a consumer of the news, you would be warranted in concluding on the basis of reading one paper or seeing one newscast a day that oh well, the media doesn't do a good job covering it.
The Center for Defense Information is led by military officers who've retired and founded this organization and now have lots of experience dealing on a daily basis with the news media. One of the people who deals the most with the media is retired Admiral Eugene Carroll, and for his concluding remarks, here is Admiral Carroll.
Well, as you can see, there are different ideas about how well the media do in covering the critical problems of our national defense programs. On one thing, I think we can all agree, TV has a particularly difficult problem with these complex issues. Short segments presented in the 6 o'clock news really don't cover all that needs to be said about defense, and it's for this reason we bring you America's Defense Monitor, which goes into real depth on some of these tough problems. We do agree very much with Melissa Healy, who thinks that all of us need to know more about these difficult problems concerning national defense. For this reason, we'd like to hear from you about what it is you want us to be presenting. What ideas for the next program do you have? Get in touch with us, give us your ideas, and we'll be happy to send you copies of our regular publication, the Defense Monitor, for your information.
The nuclear arms race must be slowed, stopped, and reversed. And the time to start is now.